Welcome back to Kindness in Real Life. A millionaire, drained from a long day, meets a homeless girl who chases him down to return what he'd lost. What begins as a simple act of honesty unravels into a journey of rediscovery, resilience, and second chances. Before starting the story, don't forget to help us reach 49 likes for this video. Thank you. The rain fell in a steady curtain over Charleston's historic district, draping the cobblestone streets in a glistening sheen that reflected the warm, amber glow of gas lamps lining the sidewalks. The air was thick with the scent of wet stone and the faint tang of salt carried in from the nearby harbor. James Harper pulled the collar of his trench coat tighter against the evening chill, his tall frame cutting through the crowded streets as he wove between tourists clutching umbrellas and locals hurrying toward shelter. His leather loafers tapped sharply against the uneven stones, each step a rhythmic echo of the long day he'd left behind. Hours of boardroom debates, financial projections, and the relentless hum of his million-dollar empire. At 38, with broad shoulders and a lean build honed by years of discipline, James carried the weight of success on his fair skin, though tonight his sharp blue eyes were dulled by exhaustion, his dark hair damp and plastered to his forehead beneath the coat's hood. The throng pulsed around him, laughter spilling from a nearby tavern, the clatter of a horse-drawn carriage rolling past, the occasional shout of a vendor hawking wares beneath a sagging awning. James barely noticed, his mind replaying the day's final meeting, a tense negotiation that had stretched into dusk, leaving him drained and craving the silence of his modern home nestled on the city's edge. His broad hand reached into his coat pocket for his phone, fingers brushing against the smooth leather of his wallet, or so he thought. He paused beneath a gas lamp, its flickering light casting jagged shadows across his angular face, his brows furrowing as he patted the pocket again. Empty. Damn it, he muttered, his voice a low growl swallowed by the rain's steady patter. His blue eyes narrowed, his fair skin tightening with a flicker of panic as he checked his other pockets. Then the strap of the sleek briefcase slung over his shoulder. Nothing. His wallet, black leather, worn smooth from years of use, stuffed with cash, cards, and a faded photo of his late father, was gone. He spun around, his trench coat flaring, his gaze darting over the wet cobblestones as he retraced his steps in his mind. The cafe. It had to be the cafe, his last stop before braving the storm, where he'd fumbled for his phone to check a message, the wallet likely slipping from his pocket onto the tiled floor. James turned on his heel, his loafers splashing through shallow puddles as he strode back toward Meeting Street, the cafe's red awning a faint smudge in the distance through the rain. His broad chest tightened, his angular jaw clenching as he calculated the loss. Not just the money, but the hassle, the time, the breach of his carefully ordered life. He was halfway down the block, his blue eyes fixed on the awning, when a voice cut through the downpour, sharp yet strained. "Excuse me, sir." He froze, his tall frame stiffening beneath the coat, his fair skin prickling as he turned. The voice came from behind, a woman, hurrying toward him through the rain, her thin figure blurred by the deluge. She was drenched, her clothes clinging to her slight frame, her dark hair hanging in limp strands around her face like a sodden curtain. James's blue eyes narrowed, his angular face tightening with suspicion as she closed the distance, her sneakers slapping against the wet stone. In her outstretched hand, she held something familiar, his black leather wallet, its surface slick with rain, glinting under the gas lamp's glow. "You dropped this back at the cafe," she said, her voice steady despite a faint tremor of exhaustion, her breath fogging in the cold air. Her fingers shook slightly as she offered it, whether from the chill or the effort of chasing him. James couldn't tell. He blinked, his blue eyes widening, his fair skin softening as he took in her appearance. She was young, mid-20s, maybe, her tan skin weathered and smudged with dirt, her thin face etched with deep lines that spoke of hardship beyond her years. Her jeans were frayed at the hems, her sneakers worn thin, the soles peeling away, and the faded jacket draped over her shoulders offered little protection from a storm. Yet her green eyes, bright and piercing beneath the wet strands of hair, held a quiet resolve that caught him off guard. "Oh, thank you," James stammered, his broad hand reaching out, his fingers brushing hers briefly as he took the wallet. Her skin was cold, rough, the dirt beneath her nails stark against her tan complexion. He flipped it open, his blue eyes scanning the contents. Cash still folded neatly, cards in their slots, the photo untouched. Everything intact. She could have taken it all, disappeared into the night with no one the wiser, but she hadn't. His angular jaw slackened, his fair skin warming with a mix of relief and disbelief as he looked up at her. "You didn't have to do this." "It wasn't mine," she replied simply, her green eyes steady, her thin face expressionless as she shrugged. A small, weary gesture that seemed to carry the weight of her world. Water dripped from her hair onto her cheeks, tracing paths through the grime. But she stood there, unflinching, as if the rain were just another part of her day. James studied her, his blue eyes tracing the lines of her face, the quiet dignity that clung to her despite her ragged state. She wasn't begging, wasn't asking for anything, just standing there, soaked and shivering, her small hands tucked in her jacket pockets now that the wallet was returned. Something stirred in him, a flicker of gratitude laced with guilt. "You look like you could use a warm meal," he said before he could stop himself, his voice softer now, his tall frame leaning slightly toward her. "And a dry place to sit. Please, let me take you somewhere." Her green eyes widened, her thin face tensing, her tan skin paling as she took a half step back. I'm fine," she stammered, her small hands rising defensively, her gaze darting to the sidewalk as if searching for an escape. "Really, it's the least I can do," James insisted, his blue eyes earnest, his fair skin steady as he gestured toward the street. "You went out of your way for me. Let me return the favor." The rain fell harder, a cold sheet between them, drumming against the cobblestones as they stood there, locked in a silent standoff. James could see her weighing his words, her green eyes flickering with doubt, her thin face taut with suspicion honed by survival. Finally, her shoulders slumped slightly, her small hands dropping to her sides. "Just for a little while," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the storm, her gaze still fixed on the ground. "Great," James said, a reassuring smile breaking across his angular face, his fair skin brightening. "I'm James." "Elise," she replied, her green eyes darting up briefly before dropping again, her tan skin shadowed as she hugged her arms tighter around herself. "This way," James said, nodding toward his car parked a block away, a sleek black sedan gleaming under the streetlights. Elise hesitated, her sneakers scuffing the wet stone, but she followed, her steps tentative, as if each one pulled her closer to a ledge she wasn't sure she could trust. James opened the passenger door, his broad hand steady, and she slid inside, her soaked clothes leaving faint streaks on the leather seat. He didn't mind, his blue eyes softening as he rounded the car and started the engine, the hum of the heater cutting through the rain's relentless drone. The drive was quiet, the windshield wipers slashing through the downpour, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and red. James stole a glance at her, her slight frame rigid, her small hands clutching her arms, her green eyes fixed on the rain-speckled window. Something about her felt familiar, a shadow he couldn't place, but he let it go, focusing instead on the road ahead. Tonight, he'd lost something and found it again, thanks to her. And now, beneath the storm's gray veil, a fragile thread of kindness began to weave between them, one that neither could yet see would stretch far beyond this rainy Charleston night. The rain lashed against the windshield of James Harper's sleek black sedan, wipers cutting through the downpour in a steady, hypnotic sweep. Charleston's historic streets faded into the rearview, cobblestone alleys yielding to broader avenues where moss-draped oaks swayed in the storm's grip, their branches clawing at the sky. James held the wheel with steady hands, his tall frame relaxed yet attentive, damp dark hair curling beneath the collar of his trench coat. The dashboard's faint glow lit his face as he navigated the wet roads, his focus occasionally shifting to the passenger seat. Elise sat there, rigid and small, her tan skin glistening with rainwater, dark hair plastered in wet strands across her thin face. She stared out the window, arms clutched tightly around herself, her frayed jacket and worn jeans leaving damp streaks on the leather upholstery. The heater hummed, pumping warmth into the car, but Elise remained stiff, her silence a wall against the comfort. James kept quiet, sensing the tension in her hunched shoulders, the way her small hands trembled faintly as if poised to flee. The city's golden lights dimmed behind them, swallowed by the outskirts' darkness, until they reached his neighborhood, a quiet stretch where modern homes stood stark against ancient trees. His house loomed ahead, a sleek white structure of glass and steel, its wide windows glowing softly through the rain, a sharp departure from Charleston's old-world charm. Elise's thin face tightened as the sedan pulled into the driveway, the garage door sliding open with a low hum. "This is your place?" she murmured, her voice barely rising above the engine's purr, her hands gripping her arms harder. "Yeah," James said, his voice calm, a faint smile tugging his lips as he parked and shut off the car. "Just a house. Nothing to worry about." He stepped out, loafers clicking on the polished concrete, and circled to open her door, his trench coat flaring slightly in the dim garage light. Elise hesitated, her tan skin quivering as she climbed out, sneakers squeaking wetly against the floor, her slight figure hunched as if bracing for something unseen. Inside, the foyer welcomed them with warmth and light. Hardwood floors gleaming under a high ceiling, a minimalist chandelier casting a soft golden glow over a sleek staircase. The air held a subtle scent of cedar and lavender, drifting from a diffuser on a side table. James set his briefcase down, peeling off his dripping trench coat to reveal a white shirt and tailored slacks, then hung it on a rack. "Come on in," he said gently, gesturing her forward, his tone easy despite the curiosity flickering in his expression. Elise paused at the threshold, her gaze sweeping the space. The towering windows framing the storm, the plush rugs softening the floor, the modern furniture exuding quiet luxury. Her tan skin stood out against the pristine white walls, her thin face a mix of awe and unease as she clutched her jacket tighter, hands trembling. "This is too much," she whispered, her voice dry, her eyes darting as if the room might swallow her whole. James shrugged, his expression softening with a hint of self-awareness. "It's just a place to live. I don't use half of it." He nodded toward the hallway, his hand steady. "Let me show you to the bathroom. You can clean up, get out of those wet clothes." She followed, steps tentative, sneakers leaving faint wet trails on the wood. The guest bathroom gleamed when he opened the door, marble tiles shining under recessed lights, a spacious glass shower promising warmth, plush white towels stacked neatly on the counter. Elise stopped short, her thin face tightening as she took in the opulence, so far from the grimy shelters she'd known. "I'll leave some dry clothes outside the door," James said, stepping back, his tone firm but kind. "Take your time." "Thanks," she murmured, her voice a whisper, her tan skin paling as she stepped inside, small hands brushing the doorframe as if testing its solidity. James closed the door softly and headed to the kitchen, his tall frame moving with purpose. Alone, Elise leaned against the door, her slight figure trembling as the silence pressed in, a stark shift from the street's constant clamor. The warmth seeped into her, thawing a chill she'd carried too long. She approached the sink, catching her reflection in the wide mirror. Hollow cheeks, dark circles framing her gaze, tan skin streaked with grime beneath wet hair. The woman staring back was a stranger, her thin face etched with years she'd buried. She turned on the faucet, splashing warm water over her hands, fingers shaking as the sensation steadied her, washing away dirt in slow swirls. She shed her soaked clothes, jacket, jeans, a threadbare shirt, folding them neatly on the counter despite their worn state, a reflex from a life that once had structure. Stepping into the shower, she let the hot water pour over her, jets easing the knots in her muscles. Steam fogged the glass, and for the first time in months, She stood still, tin skin soaking in the heat, eyes closing as tears mixed with the water. Memories flickered. Her mother's soft hum over a sewing machine, the vibrant fabrics of a boutique she'd poured her heart into, the sharp betrayal that ripped it away. She scrubbed harder, hands rough against her skin, as if she could erase not just the rain but the weight of those losses. In the kitchen, James clattered a pot onto the counter, the sound breaking the house's quiet hum. He'd swapped his shirt for a gray sweater, sleeves rolled up over his forearms, his face calm under the pendant lights as he stirred a pot of chicken soup. The aroma of broth and herbs wafted through the air, a simple gesture he hoped might ease her guard. His thoughts drifted back to her. The honesty in her voice, the hesitation in her steps, the quiet strength beneath her weariness. Something about her nagged at him, a shadow he couldn't pin down, stirring a memory just out of reach. The faint squeak of sneakers interrupted him. Elise appeared at the kitchen's edge, her slight frame wrapped in the clothes he'd left, a loose black sweater and joggers that hung a bit too big, her damp hair combed back, tin skin scrubbed clean. Her thin face, free of grime, revealed a fragile beauty beneath the exhaustion, her expression still guarded. James straightened, gesturing to the dining table. "I made soup," he said, keeping his tone light. "Nothing fancy, but it's warm." Elise paused, hands tucking into the sweater's sleeves, her gaze sweeping the room. The sleek counters, the steaming bowl, the soft light, before settling on him. "Thank you," she said softly, stepping closer, her tin skin easing as she sat, the aroma coaxing her forward. They ate in silence, spoons clinking against bowls in a quiet rhythm beneath the rain's distant drum. James watched her, noting her slow, deliberate bites, her thin face softening with each taste. She savored it, hand steady now, as if it were her first real meal in weeks. "Why are you doing this?" she asked abruptly, her voice low but clear, her gaze lifting to his. James paused, his jaw tilting slightly, his expression honest. "Because you didn't have to chase me down in the rain," he said. "You could have kept the wallet, but you didn't. That says something." Elise looked down, her tin skin tightening, hands gripping the spoon. "You don't know me," she murmured, her voice shadowed. "Not yet," James replied, his tone warm, leaning back slightly. "But I'd like to." The rain pounded on, a fragile thread of trust weaving tighter between them. One spun from kindness, curiosity, and the echoes of lives they'd yet to uncover. The rain had softened to a gentle patter against the towering windows of James Harper's sleek home, its rhythm a faint whisper against the hum of the kitchen's pendant lights. The dining table sat between them, a simple wooden expanse holding two steaming bowls of chicken soup, their surfaces now half empty, the air thick with the scent of broth and herbs. James leaned back in his chair, his tall frame at ease in a gray sweater, sleeves rolled up, his damp dark hair drying into loose waves. His face carried a quiet curiosity, softened by the warm glow above as he watched Elise across the table. She sat hunched slightly, her slight figure wrapped in the oversized black sweater and joggers he'd lent her, tin skin scrubbed clean and glowing faintly under the light. Her dark hair, still damp, framed her thin face in soft strands, her small hands cradling the spoon as if it anchored her to the moment. The silence stretched, broken only by the clink of metal against ceramic and the occasional drip of rain beyond the glass. Elise ate slowly, each bite deliberate, her thin face easing with every taste, as if the warmth were unraveling a knot she'd carried too long. James didn't rush her, his steady presence a contrast to the storm she'd left behind. He traced the edge of his mug with a finger, the faint steam curling upward, his thoughts drifting back to her words, "You don't know me," and the shadow they cast. There was something in her voice, a raw edge that tugged at him, stirring a memory he couldn't grasp. "Why'd you give it back?" he asked finally, his voice low and even, breaking the quiet like a stone dropped into still water. "The wallet. Most people wouldn't have bothered." Elise paused, her spoon hovering midair, her tan skin tightening as her thin face flickered with unease. She set the spoon down, hands retreating into the sweater's sleeves, her gaze dropping to the table. "It wasn't mine," she said again, her tone flat but firm, echoing her earlier reply on the rainy street. She shrugged, a small, weary gesture, as if the answer explained everything. James tilted his head, his expression thoughtful, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Still," he said, "you ran through the rain to find me. That's not nothing." Her thin face stiffened, her hands clenching beneath the table, tense skin quivering faintly. She didn't look up, her dark hair falling forward like a curtain, shielding her from his gaze. "Didn't have anywhere else to be," she muttered, her voice barely audible, laced with a bitterness that caught him off guard. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, his tall frame steady. "You could have kept it," he pressed gently, not accusing, just probing. "Cash, cards, enough to get you through a few days, maybe more. Why not?" Elise's hands tightened into fists, her thin face lifting just enough for him to catch the glint of defiance in her expression. "Because I'm not a thief," she said, her voice sharper now, cutting through the room's warmth. "I've lost everything, but I'm not that." Her tan skin flushed, her words hanging heavy between them, raw and unguarded, a glimpse of the fire beneath her weariness. James sat back, his face softening, a flicker of respect crossing his features. "Fair enough," he said, his tone gentle, letting the moment settle. He took a sip from his mug, the soup's warmth steadying his thoughts. "You don't talk much about yourself, do you?" She shrugged again, her thin face closing off, hands loosening as she picked up the spoon once more. "Not much to say," she replied, her voice quieter now, retreating behind the wall she'd built. She scooped another bite, her tan skin calming as she focused on the bowl, the act of eating a shield against his questions. But James wasn't ready to let it drop. He studied her, the way her small hands moved with a precision that hinted at something more, a skill, a past beyond the streets. "Where'd you learn to fold clothes like that?" he asked, nodding toward the hallway where her wet jacket and jeans sat neatly stacked outside the bathroom. Most people would have just dumped them. Elise froze, her spoon clattering softly against the bowl, her thin face paling as her hands stilled. Her tan skin tightened, her gaze darting to the side, caught off guard by the observation. "I used to care about things like that," she said slowly, her voice low, as if the words were pulled from a place she'd locked away. "A long time ago." "A long time ago," James echoed, his tone curious but careful, his tall frame leaning in just enough to signal interest without pushing too hard. "What did you do back then?" Her thin face hardened, her hands retreating to her lap, tense skin trembling faintly. She didn't answer right away, the silence thickening as the rain tapped against the windows, a metronome to her hesitation. "I had a shop," she said finally, her voice a whisper, her gaze fixed on the table. "A boutique. Made clothes, custom stuff. People liked it for a while." James's expression shifted, a spark of recognition flickering in his mind, though he couldn't place why. "A boutique," he said, his voice lifting slightly. "That's not easy to pull off. Takes talent." Elise's thin face twisted, a bitter laugh escaping her lips, sharp and hollow. "Didn't matter," she said, her tan skin flushing with old wounds. "It's gone now. Someone I trusted took it all, money, everything. Left me with nothing but debts I couldn't pay." Her hands clenched again, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and shame. "I tried to keep it going, but after my mom died, I couldn't." The words hung in the air, heavy and jagged, the first crack in her guarded shell. James sat still, his face softening with a quiet empathy, his tall frame steady as he absorbed her story. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, sincere. "That's a hell of a thing to go through." She shrugged, her thin face closing off again, hands brushing her hair back as if to shake off the vulnerability. "It's just life," she muttered, her tense skin steadying, though her voice betrayed the lie. James watched her, the pieces of her past clicking into place, stirring that nagging sense of familiarity. He leaned back, his mind drifting to a memory. High school, a classroom buzzing with chatter, a girl who'd stood up to a bully with a sharp tongue and sharper wit. "Wait," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet, his face lighting up with realization. "Lincoln High, class of 2005. You were there, weren't you?" Elise's thin face snapped up, her tan skin paling, hands freezing mid-motion. "What?" she breathed, her voice tight, caught off guard. "Biology class," James said, his tone brightening, a grin tugging at his lips. "Junior year. There was this guy, Trevor Daniels. He used to hassle me every day. One time, you tore into him in front of everyone. Called him a wannabe thug with a peanut brain. The whole class lost it." He chuckled, his tall frame relaxing as the memory sharpened. "Trevor never bothered me again after that." Her thin face softened, a faint flush creeping across her tense skin as the memory surfaced, dim but real. I forgot about that," she said, her voice hesitant, hands loosening their grip. A small, reluctant smile flickered on her lips, the first he'd seen before it faded. "That was a long time ago." "Yeah," James said, his expression warm, leaning forward again. "But I didn't forget. You were fearless back then." Elise looked down, her thin face shadowing, hands tucking back into her sleeves. "I'm not that person anymore," she said quietly, her thin skin tightening with a mix of regret and resolve. "Maybe not," James replied, his voice steady, his tall frame still. "But she's still in there somewhere. I can see it." The rain drummed on, softer now, a backdrop to the fragile bridge forming between them. Elise didn't respond, her thin face a mask of doubt, her thin skin steady as she stared at her bowl. But James saw it, the spark of the girl she'd been, buried beneath years of loss, flickering faintly in the quiet of his home. And as the night deepened, he knew this was only the beginning, a chance encounter stretching toward something neither could yet name. The rain had dwindled to a faint drizzle by the time the clock ticked past midnight, its soft taps against the windows of James Harper's sleek home blending into the stillness of the night. The kitchen lights cast a warm glow over the dining table, now cleared of soup bowls, leaving only 2 mugs of chamomile, tea steaming faintly in the quiet. James sat back in his chair, his tall frame relaxed in a gray sweater, damp dark hair settling into loose waves as he cradled his mug. Across from him, Elise perched on the edge of her seat, her slight figure still wrapped in the oversized black sweater and joggers, thin skin glowing softly under the pendant lights. Her dark hair, now drying, framed her thin face in gentle strands, her small hands wrapped around her mug as if drawing strength from its warmth. The silence between them was comfortable now, a shift from the tension of earlier hours. The echoes of their high school memory, her sharp-witted stand against Trevor Daniels, lingered like a faint melody, softening the edges of the night. James sipped his tea, the floral scent grounding him as he watched her, noting the way her thin face flickered between guarded resolve and fragile openness. Elise stared into her mug, her tan skin steady, her hands tracing the rim absently, as if lost in thoughts she wasn't ready to share. "You said you made clothes," James ventured, his voice low and casual, breaking the quiet with care. "Custom stuff. What was your favorite part of it?" Elise's thin face tightened, her hands pausing mid-motion, thin skin quivering faintly as the question pulled her back to a life she'd buried. She didn't look up, her dark hair falling forward slightly, a shield against the past. "The designing," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "Sketching ideas, picking fabrics, watching something come to life from nothing. People would smile when they wore what I made. That felt good." James nodded, his expression warm, leaning forward just enough to signal interest. "Sounds like you were good at it," he said, his tone genuine. "Takes a lot to make something people connect with like that." Her thin face twisted, a shadow crossing her tan skin as she set the mug down, hands retreating into her sleeves. "Doesn't matter now," she muttered, her voice tinged with bitterness. "It's all gone, shop, designs, everything. Burned out after it all fell apart." He tilted his head, his tall frame steady, face softening with quiet understanding. "What happened?" he asked, not pressing too hard. just enough to keep the thread alive. Elise's hands clenched beneath the table, her thin face hardening, thin skin flushing with old wounds. My mom got sick, she said, her voice low, raw. Cancer. Took her fast, too fast. She was the one who kept me going, believed in me when I didn't. After she was gone, I couldn't keep up. Then my partner, someone I trusted, cleaned out the accounts. Left me with debts I couldn't pay, bills piling up. The shop closed and I just fell. Her words trembled, her tan skin tightening as she stared at the table, the weight of it spilling out like thread unraveling from a spool. James sat still, his face etched with empathy, his tall frame a quiet anchor in the storm of her confession. That's more than anyone should have to carry, he said softly, his voice steady. You didn't deserve that. She shrugged, her thin face closing off, hands brushing her hair back as if to shake off the vulnerability. Doesn't change it, she said, her tan skin steadying, though her voice carried a faint crack. I tried to start over. New jobs, new plans, but nothing stuck. Ended up with nothing but what you saw tonight. He leaned back, his expression thoughtful, the mug warm in his hands. You're still here, though, he said, his tone firm but kind. That's not nothing. Takes guts to keep going after all that. Elise's thin face flickered, her tin skin softening as she met his gaze briefly, then looked away. Doesn't feel like guts, she murmured, hands tightening around her mug. Feels like surviving. Maybe it's both, James replied, his voice gentle, his tall frame leaning in slightly. And maybe surviving's the first step to something more. He paused, a spark of an idea lighting his face. Do you ever think about designing again? Her thin face snapped up, her tan skin paling, hands freezing mid-motion. What? She said, her voice tight, caught off guard. I haven't touched a sketchbook in years. I wouldn't even know where to start. You started once, he said, his tone encouraging, a faint smile tugging his lips. You could do it again. Small steps, maybe just a sketch, see how it feels. Elise's hands trembled, her thin face a mix of doubt and longing, tin skin quivering as she stared at him. I don't have anything left, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. No supplies, no space, nothing. James grinned, his tall frame straightening as he set his mug down. That's an easy fix, he said, his voice brightening. Come on, I've got an idea. He stood, motioning for her to follow, his steps purposeful as he led her down the hallway. Elise hesitated, her slight figure rising slowly, skin tense as she trailed behind, her sneakers scuffing softly against the hardwood. He opened a door to a small study, a room of clean lines and modern charm, with a wide desk beneath a window, shelves lined with books, and a faint scent of leather in the air. The drizzle outside streaked the glass, casting faint shadows across the space. James rummaged through a drawer, pulling out a pristine sketch pad and a handful of pencils, their tips sharp and untouched. Here, he said, handing them to her, his face alight with quiet excitement. It's not much, but it's a start. Elise stared at the supplies, her thin face paling, hands hovering as if afraid to touch them. Her tan skin trembled, her dark hair framing a mix of disbelief and yearning. I can't, she started, her voice shaky, but James cut her off gently. You can, he said, his tall frame steady, his tone firm. Just try. One sketch. No pressure, just see what comes out. Her small hands closed around the sketch pad, tin skin steadying as she clutched it to her chest, her thin face a battleground of fear and flicker of hope. Why are you doing this? She asked again, her voice softer now, searching his expression. James shrugged, his face honest, leaning against the desk. Because I've been where you are, down, thinking it's over. Someone gave me a chance once, pull me back up. I see that same fight in you, Elise. You just need a push. Her thin face softened, her tin skin warming as his words sank in, hands gripping the sketch pad tighter. She didn't respond, but the silence felt different now, less guarded, more open. James stepped back, giving her space, his tall frame a quiet presence as he nodded toward the desk. Take your time, he said. I'll be in the kitchen if you need me. He left her there, the door clicking shut softly behind him, the drizzle outside a gentle backdrop to the moment. Elise stood alone, her slight figure framed by the room's clean lines, tan skin glowing faintly under the desk lamp as she set the sketchpad down. Her small hands hesitated, fingers brushing the pencils, the familiar weight stirring memories of late nights sketching, of fabrics unfolding into dresses, of a life she'd loved. With a shaky breath, she opened the pad, its blank pages staring back like a challenge. The first line was tentative, a wobbly curve across the paper, her thin face tightening with doubt. But as she drew, slowly, then with growing rhythm, the lines sharpened, forming the outline of a dress, simple yet elegant, with a draped neckline and subtle flare. Her tan skin steadied, her hands moving with a muscle memory she thought she'd lost. The sketch took shape, a fragile thread of her old self weaving into the present, and for the first time in years, a small, hesitant smile curved her lips. Outside, the rain faded to silence, the night stretching toward dawn, a new beginning stitched together, one pencil stroke at a time. The morning sun spilled through the wide windows of James Harper's sleek home, casting golden streaks across the hardwood floors and bathing the study in a soft, hopeful light. The storm had long passed, leaving Charleston's air crisp and clean, the faint scent of wet earth drifting in as Elise sat at the desk, her slight figure hunched over the sketchpad. Her tan skin glowed in the sunlight, dark hair tucked behind her ears, framing her thin face as she worked. The oversized black sweater hung loosely on her, sleeves pushed up to reveal small hands moving with quiet purpose. Pencil scratching against paper, lines weaving into shapes that danced with memory and possibility. The room was still, save for the rustle of pages and the occasional chirp of birds beyond the glass, a peaceful contrast to the chaos she'd known. Days had turned into weeks since that rainy night, each one a small step forward, stitched together by James's steady encouragement and the fragile spark reigniting within her. The sketchpad, once pristine, now brimmed with designs, dresses with flowing hemlines, blouses with delicate pleats, skirts that blended boldness with grace. Elise's thin face softened as she flipped through them, her tan skin warming with a mix of pride and disbelief. The pencil felt like an old friend now, its weight familiar, her hands steady as they traced the outlines of a life she'd thought lost forever. She paused on her latest sketch, a midnight blue dress with a draped neckline, subtle stitching flaring at the waist. A piece that echoed her old boutique days, but carried a new strength, her strength. A soft knot pulled her from her thoughts. James leaned in the doorway, his tall frame casual in a white shirt and jeans, damp dark hair tousled from a morning run. His face lit with a warm grin as he held 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling upward in lazy spirals. "Morning," he said, his voice bright, stepping in to set a mug on the desk. "You've been at it early." Elise's thin face lifted, her tan skin easing as she took the mug, hands wrapping around its warmth. "Couldn't sleep," she said, her voice quiet but steady, a faint smile tugging her lips. "Kept thinking about this one." She nodded at the sketch, her small hands brushing the page with a tentative pride. James leaned over, his tall frame casting a shadow across the desk as he studied the design, his expression shifting to quiet admiration. "That's incredible," he said, his tone genuine, straightening up with a nod. "Looks like something people would line up for." Her thin face flushed, tan skin warming as she looked down, hands tightening around the mug. "Maybe," she murmured, doubt flickering beneath the hope. "I don't know if it's good enough yet." "It's more than good enough," James said, his voice firm, pulling a chair to sit across from her. "You've got something here, Elise, something real. You should show it to someone." Her thin face tightened, hands pausing mid-motion, tan skin quivering faintly. "Show it," she echoed, her voice shaky, the idea both thrilling and terrifying. "I wouldn't even know where to start." James grinned, his tall frame leaning back, face alight with an idea. "I do," he said. "There's a boutique downtown, small, local, run by a woman named Margaret. She's always looking for new designers. I've seen her shop. It's the kind of place your stuff would fit perfectly. Elise's thin face paled, her tan skin trembling as she stared at him, hands clutching the sketch pad. I can't just walk in there, she said, her voice rising slightly, edged with panic. What if she hates it? What if it's not ready? She won't hate it, James replied, his tone steady, his tall frame a quiet anchor. And it's ready because you made it. You've been ready. You just need to take the leap. He paused, his face softening. I'll go with you if you want. Make it easier. Her small hands hesitated, tense skin steadying as she traced the sketch, her thin face a battleground of fear and flicker of resolve. Okay, she said finally, her voice barely audible, a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. But just to show her, no promises. The boutique sat nestled on a quiet corner of Charleston's historic district, its brick facade draped in trailing ivy, a chalkboard sign by the door announcing local designers welcome in looping white script. Inside, the air was warm and inviting, racks of colorful clothing arranged with care, the faint scent of lavender lingering from a diffuser on the counter. Margaret, a woman with curly hair and a kind smile, greeted them as the bell jingled overhead, her face brightening when James introduced Elise. She's got some designs you'll want to see, he said, his tall frame stepping back to let Elise take the lead, his grin reassuring. Elise's thin face tensed, her tan skin quivering as she opened the sketch pad with shaky hands, laying it on the counter. Margaret leaned in, her expression thoughtful as she flipped through the pages, pausing on the midnight blue dress. This is stunning, she said, her voice warm, holding the sketch up to catch the light. The lines, the flow, it's got heart. You made this. Elise nodded, her thin face flushing, hands twisting nervously behind her back. Yeah, she said, her voice small. It's just something I've been working on. It's more than that, Margaret replied, her smile widening. I'd love to carry this in the shop. Start with a small batch, see how it goes. What do you think? Her thin face froze, thin skin paling as the words sank in, hands trembling faintly. You mean, sell it? She breathed, disbelief threading her voice. Absolutely, Margaret said, her tone firm. You've got talent, Elise. Let's get it out there. James's face broke into a wide grin, his tall frame steady as he nodded at her. Told you, he said, his voice teasing but proud. Elise's thin face softened, her thin skin warming with a fragile joy, hands unclenching as she nodded back. A quiet yes that felt like a door swinging open. Weeks later, the boutique buzzed with life, its windows showcasing Elise's designs, dresses and blouses hanging on racks, the midnight blue piece front and center, its fabric catching the sunlight in soft folds. Customers milled about, their murmurs of admiration filling the air as Margaret rang up sales, her smile wide. Elise stood near the back, her slight figure dressed in a simple skirt and top she'd sewn herself, thin skin glowing with a quiet pride, her thin face alight with a mix of awe and relief. Her hands clutched a small notebook, once Cody's gift, now hers, filled with new sketches, dreams spilling onto every page. James joined her, his tall frame casual in a jacket and jeans, his face beaming as he handed her a coffee. Look at this, he said, nodding at the crowd. You did it, Elise. They love it. Her thin face lifted, thin skin steady as she watched a woman try on the blue dress, smiling at her reflection. I can't believe it, she said, her voice soft, hands tightening around the notebook. It feels real. It is real, James replied, his tone warm, his tall frame a steady presence beside her. You built this from nothing. That's all you. Elise's thin face softened, her thin skin warming with a gratitude she couldn't voice. Not all me, she said, glancing at him. You pushed me, gave me a chance when I didn't see one. Thank you, James. He shrugged, his face honest, leaning against the wall. You had it in you, he said. I just handed you the pencil. The boutique hummed on, the day stretching into evening, and as the last customer left, Elise stepped outside, the cool air brushing her tan skin, her thin face peaceful. James followed, his tall frame beside her, and they stood in silence, watching the city lights flicker against the dusk. She opened her notebook, flipping to a blank page, her small hand steady as she wrote. This is just the beginning. The thread of kindness that had started in the rain had woven them here. A new life, stitched together from broken pieces, stronger than either had imagined. And as the stars blinked awake above Charleston, Elise knew she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving, her future hers to shape, one design at a time. Elise stood outside the boutique, the city lights glinting off her thin face, the small notebook clutched tightly in her hands. James stood quietly beside her, his warm smile a beacon like that rainy night long ago. From a wallet lost in a storm, a journey had begun. From the ashes of loss, Elise wove a new life with every stitch and sketch. She was no longer a shadow adrift, but a woman daring to dream again. James, with simple kindness, had planted a seed of hope, proving a single act could change everything. No matter how broken life gets, you're never truly alone. A small gesture of compassion, or a chance you give yourself, can mend the tears and light the way forward. Trust in that and start new.